Good afternoon and welcome to The Body and Its Image. I'm Francis Levy. Ed Nersessian and I are co-directors of the Philoctetes Center. And before we begin this afternoon's roundtable, I just wanted to call your attention to the art on the walls, which is part of an exhibit that's very appropriate because of the title of today's roundtable. This is The Body as Image, and this is The Body and Its Image. And this exhibition actually ties into the whole series of roundtables on sexuality. It's figuratively and literally related to it. And there are, as you can see, perverse and diverse images related to some of the themes that will be brought up in Sextet. Now, Edward Albee, Nicholson Baker, Judith Thurman, and Simon Winchester will be all on people who are appearing on Philoctetes roundtables throughout the fall. So we have a number of interesting panelists coming. And what people constantly say, there's a lot going on here at Philoctetes. We are having, I'd say, I don't know the exact number of roundtables, but most days of the week we have some kind of an activity going on. And the best way to find out what we're doing is to go to philoctetes.org. Also, all Philoctetes roundtables are in the archive. If you go to archive at philoctetes.org, you can see all the roundtables. It goes up about 2 or 3 days after the event, so you don't have to miss these events. And also, we simulcast. So like what you're seeing now is being seen by people in front of their computers. I am now pleased to introduce Sander Gilman. Sander Gilman is a distinguished professor of the liberal arts and sciences and professor of psychiatry at Emory University, where he is director of the program in psychoanalysis and the Health Sciences Humanities Initiative. A cultural and literary historian, he is the author or editor of 80 books. His Oxford lectures, Multiculturalism and the Jews, appeared in 2006. His most recent edited volume, Diets and Dieting, A Cultural Encyclopedia, appeared in 2007. He has held professorships in humanities and medicine at Cornell University, the University of Chicago, and the University of Illinois at Chicago. He has also served as a visiting historical scholar at the National Library of Medicine in Bethesda, as a fellow at Stanford's Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, as a Berlin Prize Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin, and as the Weidenfeld Visiting Professor of European Comparative Literature at Oxford University. Dr. Gilman will moderate this afternoon's panel and introduce our other distinguished guests. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Francis. First of all, thank you all for coming. And thank you all, by the way, for each and every one of you bringing your bodies with you, since that will be actually the topic of our conversation today. I want to give short introductions, not obituaries, to my co-panelists. And the format will be that then I and they will speak for 5 or 6 minutes, talking about our understanding of the body and its image. We will then have a conversation among ourselves, if we're interesting enough to do that, and then we will open it up to a conversation with you all. So hold your fire, listen hard, and prepare difficult questions that none of us, of course, will be able to answer, but that you, in your heart of hearts, know the answer to already. Let me start by introducing Marina Abramovic, one of America's and Bulgaria's most noted performance artists.
Yugoslavia, no Bulgaria.
Yugoslavia.
It's so big difference.
It's a huge difference. It is a huge difference. I apologize. In Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia. Performance artist, widely seen both here in Europe. Her most recent performances include House with Ocean View at the Sean Kelly Gallery here in New York and 7 Easy Pieces at the Guggenheim. Paul Campos, professor of law at the University of Colorado. He is the author of Obesity Myth and widely read as a syndicated columnist on the Scripps Howard News Service. Marcel Kinsbourne is a behavioral neurologist, professor of psychology at the New School. And to my left, may I introduce Sabine Wilhelm, who is associate professor of psychology at Harvard Medical School and one of the leading experts on body dysmorphic disorder, especially seen from a cognitive behavioral perspective. I'm going to begin. That's the huge advantage of moderating, right? I'm going to begin, and I'm going to begin as a historian. And I want to talk for about 5 minutes on how the body got its image. Because one of the things we can say globally is that as long as there have been human beings, or at least as long as we have records generated by human beings, going back to ancient Babylonia, going back to ancient Greece, going back to ancient China, there have always been images of the body that seem to represent the inner fantasies of a culture about the way bodies are supposed to look, not the way that bodies actually look. Thus the Babylonians generated physiognomies, handbooks of how you interpret the way people's fixed physiognomy, their noses and their foreheads, the shape of their ears, were to be read, what meanings were to be given to it. Now, having made that huge global statement, one of the interesting questions is how do we get to the history of body image in the 21st century? And in a sense, we can almost date the moment. A Viennese psychiatrist is walking across the street in New York in 1927. He's hit by a cab and he's killed. His name is Paul Schilder. He had been Freud's friend, confidant, opponent in Vienna. He had come to New York as professor of psychiatry, and he had written first published in Vienna in German, and then in New York in English, what is clearly the most important book to present the problem of the body. And Schilder creates three bodies for us. And the important thing is that he understands these three bodies as inseparable. First of all, a social body. Bodies as societies imagine them and how they shape them. In other words, bodies in the context of social networks. Second of all, a physiological body. A body that has an endocrine system, that has a neural network. A body which today we can image using MRI. And thirdly, a body that is shaped by the interiority, by the psyche. A body, in other words, which we can think about as a psychoanalytic body, or at least a psychodynamic body. A body that both responds to inner conflicts with symptoms, but also constitutes itself, literally constitutes itself in terms of that interiority. Schilder is the one, by the way, well before Didier Anzieux, who thinks about the surface of the body as something that is constituted by the unconscious. Schilder's book, by the way, which I think is one of the most important books on the body ever written, is a book then which both disappears, literally disappears, but disappears also by being absorbed into fields as dispersed as psychoanalysis and sociology, somatic medicine, and somatic psychiatry. One wonders what would have happened had he not been hit by that cab, right? And so the rest of the 20th century wrestles, first of all, with the separation of these bodies, which is quite fascinating. Each discipline chooses one of Schilder's bodies, and that discipline says, that's the body. And one of the things that strikes me that is happening ever so slowly is the need to, and I really mean the need to, combine these three bodies, the social body, the somatic body, and the psychic body, into a body. You know, we talk blithely of a mind-body duality, right? Post-Cartesian. We sort of say, oh, we've got to overcome, or Freud has overcome the mind-body duality. But we haven't quite gotten to the point of integrating those three bodies completely. Mm-hmm. And one of the conversations I'm hoping that we're going to have today, because the people around the room are people who think well about the bodies within their own disciplines, but also have a sort of reach beyond their own disciplinary limits in imagining the body. One of the things I'm hoping that we'll talk about is how we can imagine in the 21st century a body which is both social and physical and psychic. Not simultaneously, that's the wrong way of thinking about it, but as inextricably one. And maybe that was Schiller's error to think about them as three separate bodies. But his thesis was that these three bodies are what constitutes our own sense of ourselves. Now, I joked at the beginning that you brought your own bodies with you. But you brought your own bodies seen from very specific perspectives. And when you look in the mirror at your bodies, as we do when we get out of the shower in the morning, none of you are less narcissistic than I am. Right? You see one of those three bodies haunting us in the background, perhaps of the other two that we can't imagine or that we don't want to talk about. I'll turn over the microphone, metaphorically at least, to Sabine Wilhelm.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this. I think it's going to be great fun. So you had asked me to talk a little bit about body image and my perspective on body image. And as you all just heard, most of my work is on body dysmorphic disorder. And when you work with people who have body dysmorphic disorder, it becomes strikingly clear that there is such a difference between what other people might see when they look at a particular body, when they look at a person, and what a man or a woman might see him or herself when they look in the mirror. So there is a big difference between...
Just say
what it is.
What body dysmorphic is.
Yeah, I'll get to that in a second. That was just my lead-in.
Some people may not know.
Yeah. So I'm interested in body image from the aspect, of course, of body image disturbance. And I do a lot of work on body dysmorphic disorder, which is a preoccupation with an imagined defect in appearance. So in other words, these people are preoccupied with a flaw in appearance that others can't see, with something that's really non-existent, to the point where I've had people who were actually paid as models, and they came in to see me and they told me that they thought that they were really ugly. So they might come in and they might have what they consider a major scar or a horribly red face, a face that in their mind is as red as a stop sign. And I look at them and to me they look fine. Most people actually who come in have skin concerns, that the skin is too red or too pale or too scarred, that they have moles or wrinkles or whatnot, and that's followed by hair concerns, too much hair, too little hair. But really any part of the body can be the focus of concern. And on average people have 3 to 4, often usually rather circumscribed body parts that they're worried about. And of course, this causes a lot of anxiety and shame and often also depression, and nobody likes to feel that way. So therefore, people with body dysmorphic disorder often engage in avoidance behavior. They don't like dating or social situations. Family members actually often drag the patients in because they say, I'm so tired of my son or daughter not going to weddings or funerals, things like that. A lot of social avoidance and also a lot of repetitive behavior in order to make themselves feel better. A lot of mirror checking, a lot of comparing themselves with others, and not surprisingly, I guess, also a lot of plastic surgery. Right? And then people ask me very often, so where is that sort of line between what you would consider body dysmorphic disorder and what would you consider a normal appearance concern? Because of course all of us, you hinted at that already, all of us to a certain degree are a bit worried about the way that we look. And I think the line is really in the degree of distress that those people experience. It's really extreme distress, to the point that the rate of completed suicides in body dysmorphic disorder is about 45 times higher than what you might find in the general population. Obviously, not surprisingly, suicidal ideation and unsuccessful suicide attempts are also quite common. Often goes along with other anxiety disorders, in particular social anxiety disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder, and also eating disorders as well. Now, what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about is what those people say, why they might have developed body dysmorphic disorder, because I think that relates very nicely to our topic of body image and also body image disturbance, right? So very often these patients come in and they tell me about, I guess, what I would conceptualize psychological theories of their body image disturbance. So very often they will say, you know, appearance was always very important in my family. And that's how it became important to me. As a matter of fact, my mom or my dad was spending a lot of time in front of the mirror. I was only allowed to leave the house when I looked just so. You know, the hair just had to be so, my clothes had to be just so. And because there was such an impact, such an emphasis on appearance, it over time became important to me. I realized that that was something I should base my self-worth on. Often they also mention very high levels of perfectionism in the family, again, where as a result of having very high standards for appearance became sort of intertwined. Their self-worth in terms of how good they looked became directly intertwined with what they were worth as a person. But there are also theories, and that again relates directly to what you were just saying, Senna, that focus more directly on the body. So many people will say, you know, as a kid, I had maybe a particular disfigurement, or I had severe acne, or I was obese. And even though they look absolutely fine to me at the time when I see them, that poor body image is still there. So it's almost as if their appearance has changed, but the body image didn't catch up, which I always find incredibly fascinating, because again, it's another opportunity for us to see how different actual appearance and body image, how you think about your appearance, can be. And lastly, of course, there are well, not lastly, but also there are often biological theories, right? That they say, you know what, eating disorders run in my family, obsessive compulsive disorder run in my family. So I think there is just something in our genes that makes us sort of be perfectionistic, stress out about our appearance, and so on. So they just attribute it to genetics. And often they will also bring up sociocultural theories, to the point where they say, you know, every time I open a magazine or I turn on the television, I get the same message over and over again, namely that appearance is really important and I should try to improve it. And I somehow must have been affected by that. But, you know, then I often turn around and say, aha, so do you think the media or those cultural influences actually caused your body image disturbance? And then they will often say, no, I think they might make it worse, but I really don't think that that's what's caused it. And you said about 6 minutes, so I think I might have used up my time.
Do you ever have the reverse syndrome, where you have somebody with a horrible disfigurement who actually has no knowledge of the the sociological impact of their, you know, that they are in total denial?
I have not had that at all. That I've had people who were really disfigured, and sadly, and weren't aware of it. So I've actually,
because I once knew somebody who was, I hate to say this, it was a very unattractive woman who claimed that all the world desired her. She couldn't go places, and she was. I mean, it was an odd.
so some kind of delusional problem then, almost, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So anyway, I think I'm going to end right here. I can talk a little bit more later how I think all of these pieces ultimately come together. But what I wanted to tell you is what I sort of came into body dysmorphic disorder from a clinical perspective at first. And what I learned over time as the research on body dysmorphic disorder developed was that all of the studies more or less supported what my patients had known all along. So I do strongly believe that all of those factors which I just listed have a major impact on what we ultimately develop as a body image. And maybe I'll turn it over to the next person.
Thank you. Paul?
Thanks for having me here. I think it's really great to study this issue from a very interdisciplinary perspective. I think what Sabine was just saying ties in very closely with what my own work in this area has ended up focusing on, which I would, I guess, characterize as a cultural body dysmorphic disorder, in that it's not just it's something that's happening at the individual level, but it's very structural, and it's and you and your work are looking at like something extreme, but which is very commonplace in a less intense way, I think, throughout the culture as a whole. I would be very surprised if there were very many people in this room who have not had serious anxieties about their bodies in ways that can sometimes be quite disabling in terms of ordinary life. My own particular work has been focused on this concept of obesity and overweight. It's very striking that in American culture right now, we have an official, quote-unquote, scientific definition of a normal body, which only includes about 30% of the adult population. I mean, it's funny. It's not funny like a clown, but funny like in a disturbing way, right? That you've got a situation which is really very odd in the context of what a normal or normative body might be, given that it's not normal in any statistical sense that's recognizable. And I would argue that it's not normal in any kind of scientifically valid or medically valid definition of what normalcy is. Instead, it's this cultural artifact which I think is very destructive and does all kinds of damage. And I just want to mention a couple of little anecdotes as to how I got into this, because people often ask, how does a law professor end up talking about fat all the time? The way that
Law professor.
well, so, but no, here I want to emphasize something not like that, and I'm being completely non-facetious about this. I am overweight, according to the current definitions of the American medical establishment.
Exactly.
I weighed myself actually this morning so I could say this with genuine scientific accuracy. I have a BMI of a 25 and change, so I'm
You
just
had a
like
big
over.
breakfast.
Just a little
No,
bit
no, I
overweight.
did this before. I don't even eat breakfast. So anyways, I'm like definitely, so I'm overweight, right? And most of you are overweight or obese because we have these crazy definitions of these things that, again, I want to emphasize don't have any scientific validity, but nevertheless, we're stuck with them for the present. And I got into this because I was doing a conference on the Clinton impeachment, and somebody dropped out on me, so I had to fill in a gap in the program, and I was looking at the media coverage of it, and to see if there was anything to say about the media coverage, and I noticed that there were literally more than 100 stories, because I checked this on the LexisNexis, that referred to Monica Lewinsky as Zoftig. And I was just fascinated by that, especially because, I mean, this is New York City, right? So probably most people in this room know what Zoftig means. But I can guarantee you most Americans do not know what Zoftig means. It's a very odd word. But these are, these are all these. This is in the All News database, so these are just like large circulation American newspapers and magazines. Why is Monica Lewinsky's supposed fatness and Jewishness being signaled? Like, why is that significant? Why is that somehow important that Bill Clinton is, having sex or not having sex, depending on the definition that you're employing, with a fat Jewish, woman, right? So I started looking into that, and I found that there was this really fascinating, although horrifying, moral panic on this issue of fat in our culture that is, I think, really out of control now at this point, where it's very similar to reefer madness or 153 communists in the State Department or satanic ritual abuse in our preschools or all of these other sort of classic moral panics that we're having over fatness now that it's everywhere. And then what really got me, the thing that clinched the project for me in terms of how to conceptualize it was my father's a physician, and I was watching the Super Bowl with him, and there were like a huge number of ads for erectile dysfunction drugs, and each one of these, as you know, because of legal requirements in the United States, all these pharmaceutical ads always end with the catchphrase, ask your doctor if X is right for you, right? So after like literally the 12th time that we heard, ask your doctor if Cialis is right for you, my father, who's an oncologist, right, he turns to me and says, how the hell do I know if Cialis is right for you? and I realized there was really a profound point being made there, right? On a sort of more superficial level. Of course, what he knows about Cialis is what some drug company representative would tell him about it, right? He's an oncologist. There's no particular reason why he would know about the pharmacology of Cialis. But the more profound cultural point is the question of whether Cialis is right for me is fundamentally not really a medical question, except in a very trivial way, or usually a fairly trivial way. What makes something like that right for me is a complex cultural question that is mediated by all kinds of things. And I would hope there would be at least one other person besides my doctor who I would be inquiring into with the question of whether Cialis is right for me. Now, the way that hooks in with the fat business is that what I came to recognize is that fatness is a cultural construct. It's not a scientific thing fundamentally. It's not a medical thing fundamentally. What counts as fat in a culture is just varies enormously. You know, Sandra Gilman has done great historical work on this, and it's varied in this culture enormously. It varied in New York City. I know a woman in the literary world who's a size 6, and she genuinely feels fat all the time because she's in a cultural context in which she goes into boutiques where she can't find anything to wear. Now, how does that? How does the invisible hand of the market explain that a woman who's a size in a country, by the way, where the average dress size is 12 to 14, she can't find anything in a store because she's too fat, right, in a certain kind of store. Part of what's going on there has to do with this weird cultural craziness that we are in the grip of in regard to these concepts of overweight and obesity. And if there's just one thing that I wish people could take away from what I have to say today is really take a critical look at the usage of words like overweight and obese, which I think are really words that we ought to be trying to get rid of, that are essentially invalid pathologizing of a huge percentage of the population. And basically, I think that we're going to look back, I don't know when, but at some point, cultural historians will look back, and they'll see the way we're talking about fatness right now in the body, and our image of the body, and our image of the body as fat, in the same way that we look back now and say phrenology, and we just see it as this, this pseudoscience. Phrenology used to be like totally respectable. They had lots of phrenology conferences and phrenology journals, and or eugenics. The front wing of the Natural History Museum here in New York was dedicated to a celebration of eugenics in the early part of the 20th century. Now all of that is seen as very discredited. I would hope that we're going to look back eventually, for reasons I don't want to get into now because I don't have time, I've already used up too much time, into for similar reasons, we should be thinking very, very critically about this notion of seeing the fat body as diseased, pathological, sinful, a sign of all kinds of calamitous and apocalyptic sorts of things. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Paul. Marina?
So I have a good news for you. In the performance, you don't care about obesity, you don't care about fat body, ugly body, strange body. Actually, everything is welcome because it's just another media. So I've been doing this since 40 years. It's a really performance, to do performance art. So I have to really explain to you, specified what means by performance. I do. Can I have this microphone in my hand? It's much better.
No, it's okay. You're on the microphone.
But why? It's not just... Oh, no, because...
You're okay.
But she doesn't hear. I'm mostly very loud.
That's good. That's good.
Wait, now I've done something wrong.
Americans want you to speak louder if you have an accent.
Oh, that's... and I have a bad accent. Okay.
It's true. I've noticed that.
So you hear me now? It's all right. I'm sorry, my English is terrible.
No.
So, this is the story. First, I have to explain what I mean by performance. We are not talking about the theater. We are not talking about the dance. We are not talking about acting. We are talking about performance in visual art. And if you look in the history, I mean, the first really idea of body as a place, as a performance material, it was the statement was made by the Vito Conci, which was the American artist, and he said body art. So he invented the term the body art. This is early 70s, and came out of really conceptual art, when it was the concept enough to tell the story. Sometimes the concept was not even need to be realized. It was just the idea that you can in your mind realize. So it was not kind of object related or installation related work. But then he came further and he said, why we don't use your own body? Artist to use his own body. It was very, very difficult and demanding idea, because you have to be present in the front of the public, and you have to be object and subject of your work. And in this case, we have to specify what you mean by performance art. As you many artists doing performances, as many explanation and definition you have about performance art. So what I can say about performance is the performance is a kind of situation when you artists create mental and physical construction, which he actually enter in the front of the audience into this mental and physical construction and create the performance. So for me, the most interesting performances are long durational ones, where you're really talking about taking time in the performance. It's not that the public have to be there in a situation of here and now, that the performance have to be so much involving that you don't think about leaving, or you think about past or future. You're just kind of in present time, in here and now, which is very difficult. Once Maria Callas said about her performance on the stage, she said the most important and the most successful performance is if when you're performing, that you have to make sure that one part of your brain have to be in complete control, and other parts of the brain have to be completely loose and free. So if you can create that kind of balance between free and complete control, then you really can catch the public, and you have to create some kind of charismatic dialogue with the public, that they don't leave, they just mesmerize and they stay there, which is really very difficult. So the other thing with the performance, you see, what I'm interested in, I can't talk general because artist is very subjective, and we always talk about what he's interested in. And for me, it's very interesting the two major fears of human being. This is the fear of dying and fear of pain and fear of suffering. And this is to me the most interesting. So I like to stage these kind of feelings in the front of the audience and go myself through these kind of fears. And we also create situations when you're really pushing the limits, not going to have accident, die, but as far as you can go. And when you do that, you actually create a situation when the public see the performer as a mirror, and they can, if they see how I go through that, they can go in their own lives through that too. So that's the kind of situation to be created. So for me, the very important are long durational performances, and the performances who really have that kind of intensity, where you really risk something. Because the human being is very strange. You can go to see the greatest opera or greatest theater, and you're sitting there with your body, but your mind can be anywhere else. Your mind can be in Honolulu, or you're thinking about your, texting the messages, or going shopping list, or whatever, which is not the right thing. The main thing is that you have to be with your body and your mind in that place what is happening. But the same thing for the performer, because the public is like a dog. They can feel the fear, they can feel insecurity, they can feel when something doesn't go well and go wrong. So the performer have to be in the same, also in the space and time, with his body and the mind when things is happening. And when this kind of connection happen, then it's mesmerizing, then it's really the magic. Then it's really about present time. There is no past, no future, it's just now. And that's all performance what is about now. And it's very difficult art form. And this art form is not happening in the theater. It's not happening it's happening really in the gallery and museum spaces. And because it's such a demanding form, it's very few people who can actually do this. I'm, from my generation, one of the few people still doing it, because there's now young artists doing different things. But that type of performances where really create limits and kind of toughness, it's very important. Because in the way what is happening, you are creating a situation when you are leaving your lower self and you're going to kind of higher self. And that higher self, which interests me, that kind of transformation of your own self into kind of different consciousness, where you really can communicate your message in the highest level possible. And this, it's lots of energy you have to take. So this is my, thank you.
Marcel?
My perspective on body image utilizes three terms: embodiment, entrainment, and self. Embodiment, entrainment,
And what?
entrainment. Entraining means, as I will explain, right now you and I are in training. You have a reciprocity between two people and the self. And actually, Ms. Abramovic really illustrated those constructs very well already in what she was saying. So but I want to begin a little bit obliquely by saying that I realized long before I was an expert in anything that the longer you know anybody, the weirder you realize that person is. Now, I don't have literature on this, but I'll accept the consensus. Now, the reason that is the case is, I think, the following. That whereas we present ourselves occasionally to others in certain rather stylized fashion, culturally determined, our brain is running wild the whole time. Why is it doing that? Because the neurons don't stop firing. So the mind has to go on. The neurons won't let up. Now, the brain can envisage any possible thing. And what the person produces in speech and in writing is only a sorry little fraction of the sometimes brilliant concepts of the brain. When it will be possible to actually listen into people's thoughts and preserve them for future, then culture and civilization will advance at a great rate. However, listening into other people's thoughts also will destroy all social relationships, because instantly everybody will take offense at what everybody else is thinking. Now, these thought processes are to a large extent embodied, and I want to now explain that briefly. Although we talk about abstractions, actually there's good evidence that mostly we can't really represent abstractions. What we represent are instances or within the concept of the abstraction, but what we actually do is make the abstraction concrete. Just like a metaphor makes an abstract principle concrete by an instance. So when we think, we represent appearances, we represent movements, we represent situations, pictures in the mind, because we're very visual. But we embody our thoughts. Now, when we represent something in our mind and embody it, we are using the same neural programs as we would use if we actually did the thing that we were entertaining. Mm-hmm. Okay? Now, of course, if we really did the things we're thinking about, as I say, then all civilization would disappear. But we have if we're not little babies who do in fact do that, their thinking and their behavior are the same. But once inhibition is possible, we think this and we merely present that. Right? However, because these motor programs have been activated, there are subtle movements of the body anyway, including gestures, which betray the thought, at least the gist or direction of the thinking. So that actually, when we communicate with others, regardless of what we say, our postures, our movements, our gestures communicate whether our thoughts are consonant with or discrepant from what we say. Mm-hmm. Now, the self comes in as follows. When we think about anything, we are thinking that thought, and we are representing ourselves thinking. And it's us. And that would mean that the self has a place in basically most thought, other than automatic. Now, it is very clear that there is no such thing as the self, as a specific abstraction or a module in the brain. The self is a construct out of experience, and in my opinion, and I've written about this, I may be right or wrong, in my opinion, it is built out of the experience of the infant with his and her body. So the self is primarily the body. And when one thinks of oneself, one cannot do so without thinking of some representation of one's own body. So, and by the way, Nietzsche got there before me. He said, I am my body and nothing beside. And he was right, at least in that particular point. Now, the way then, if I'm correct about this, that we think about ourselves has an unavoidable element of a body image, which is where I come to our point. So when we do think, we have an image of our body in our minds. Now the obvious point to make is that that image is indeed not consonant with the appearance of our body to others. I mean, it cannot be, or it will be changing all the time, for instance. That body image is formed at some stage, may get modified slightly, and then become stationary. And I know this from my own experience, because my body image, I regret it, I'm about in my early 40s, you know, and it's really a shock. You look in the mirror, and actually that may not be the case. So I guess one has a sort of normalized and idealized image in one's mind or oneself. And I say also idealized because, like memory, it gets sort of tailored and shaped and made appealing and reassuring. So we have this image in our minds, and occasionally we're forced to match it against the reality, which is the shocking thing that, for instance, Dr. Wilhelm talked about. And I would like to use that concept in our further discussion when we talk about, you know, people with anorexia nervosa, or people who hate their bodies because they're overweight, regardless of considerations that Dr. Campos very reasonably, Mr. Campos very reasonably, well, doctor, correct? Yeah. Very reasonably presented. So my thought is that the discrepancy between how we think of ourselves and how we would like actually to appear is inherent in the thought process. Now that discrepancy, however, isn't only something inside the head, for the following reason, bringing me to my third keyword, entrainment, which is that the human species is genetically pre-programmed to want to entrain with others, to converse, to interact, and it doesn't even matter what we say to each other. The mere act of talking to each other is gratifying to quite an extent. In fact, in my opinion, most conversations don't actually say anything that anyone wants to know. It's the fact that you're conversing. How are you doing? Fine. Is it hot enough for you? Is it cold enough for you? All that stuff sounds silly, but it's entrainment, and it has its place. Now, when somebody has a wild mind, which everybody has, sooner or later they'd like to communicate that in some form, although they hesitate because they don't want to be vulnerable. One way of communicating it is to do performance art, because that legitimizes doing things that otherwise you couldn't possibly venture to do because of total social condemnation and whatever the hell. So I see performance art as the embodiment of the thoughts being acted out in the embodiment of the body. And other people, as you so beautifully described, and training with that, mirroring the feelings that you're presenting and the thoughts, and themselves being enriched by that experience. That's my point.
Marcel, doesn't sexuality, like, and you talked about people's points of view about like your self-image and it's in conflict with others.
Yeah.
But doesn't sexual attraction itself constitute a form of distortion? I mean, not that the person would be sexually attractive, but that activity, the dynamic which produces sexual attraction would produce another form of distortion in the body image, that the person perceiving the body would be in a state of temporary madness almost.
Right. When I was thinking of what I was going to say here, which actually didn't seem obvious at all, I realized I have nothing to say about sex, which is sort of humiliating. But picking up on your point, it is indeed in sexual attraction, of course, one has an image of the other's body, which is idealized, and necessarily has to be, because a cold fisheye isn't going to ever get anything, you know?
Yeah.
Now, whether you idealize your own body, truthfully, I don't think you think much about your own body in that situation. But then that's just my experience, and maybe...
Can I just add something? I was reading some time ago, it was Scientific America, this great experiment. They took volunteers, like 12 men and 12 women, and they put them separately, they didn't see each other. Then they undressed them, they have the blindfolders, and they put them together just to experience what kind of couples they will created by only they could have is touch and smell. And they create the couples, based on that kind of information without seeing each other. And when they took the blinds off, the experiment was that was 85%. There will not be the visual choice.
Huh.
85%, which is amazing.
Yeah. But
We're making huge mistakes by visual choice.
So you should have these
Blinders on.
But most of us have blinders on all the time. That's but again, I began by saying that these three bodies that Schilder had exist, and we certainly have heard all three bodies talked about, right? But I'm really interested in the notion that our bodies in this network that Paul talked about, a network which in a sense determines our fantasies of our bodies, right? You talked about it also, Sabine, is something that also provides for us one of the most powerful fantasies. And Marcel, you started talking about this, which is really interesting, which is the fact that all of us have this moment of mentalization. We can read other people's minds. In fact, we have to read other people's minds. We have to be able to get into the other person. Never mind what we've got in ourselves, we've also got to simultaneously read that mind. And we read that mind through looking at the body, in the sense that the physiognomists were right. That is, we read into people's inner life what we want to find it, but we find it reinforced by the way each one of you are looking at me right now. I know what you're thinking, right? Am I really that sexy? You want me, don't you? Right? But what is so fascinating to me is then we actually constitute that other person. That person may respond to us. And what interested me about that notion is what happens, and you've raised this, and I want to just raise this as a problem, what happens when we are dealing with someone who does not see. And we know this with blind infants, that they have very great difficulty in making those connections, with the caregiver, right? The caregiver is present but also absent in the way that we as human beings, from the time we are neonates, that's what's so fascinating about it. We read into the other the things that we need for the other to give to us. And so that notion that that body is constituted in our social world, yes, with all of its fantasies, in our developmental world, but also, and here we haven't talked about it very much, and I'll throw this out, none of us has actually talked about the quote-unquote real body. Right? We've talked about social fantasies. We've talked about the psychic bodies. You touched a little bit on it. You said, you know, these people come into me and they complain about their bodies, but they're quote unquote not ugly.
No.
Why do you say that? Maybe they really are ugly.
Well, there is actually some literature showing that most people would agree on what beautiful and what ugly is. So there is sort of this saying that, is it beauty is in the eye of the beholder or something, right? Yeah, that's actually not true because, you know, most people would actually agree this is an attractive person and this is not an attractive person. But, you know, and people who are attractive are actually, again, there's evidence for that, are treated very different from people who are generally considered unattractive. They get better jobs. If they are involved in some kind of legal trouble, they get away with a smaller fine. All of this stuff, which of course, Paul, yes.
I mean, making that very concrete in terms of the current affairs, I mean, Sarah Palin has like a realistic possibility of actually being president of the United States because a lot of
Bite your tongue.
Oh, we don't do politics here?
I mean, it's an important, I think it's an important thing to address. I mean, when I was watching her on TV the other night and she was like winking at the audience, I was struck by, first of all, the sense, of course, that this was this completely surreal situation. You know, have I gone crazy? You know, am I on drugs? What's happening to the world, etc. But also with the recognition that this actually works. I mean, this really does, and this is absolutely the crucial element of her power, and which might expand a great deal. Because we do, in fact, put such an enormous cachet on that.
Yes.
And then, speaking of this dysmorphism, I think it's really important to emphasize that if you look at the bodies of people in this country, and really internationally, but in this country, you're looking at, if you're looking at, say, body mass, you're looking at a Gaussian distribution. You're looking at just a bell curve, essentially. If you look at the representations of the body that are in the media, what you will see is that between the first and the third percentile of body mass on the distribution is the normal body for a female in this culture. What are the cultural effects of taking 2% of the population at the far, far left end of the tail and constantly bombarding people with the message, this is normal, this is normal, this is normal, this is normal. Outside of that, you have a disease, right? I mean, I think you see the effects. I mean, you see the quote-unquote extreme cases, but the less extreme cases are pretty disturbing too in terms of the actual social effects, I think.
American culture is completely wrong to start with. Absolutely. I mean, first here, if you are not young, being old is like being dirty or something. You know, you have to be always young and always look great. And it's so misrepresentation. If you see the just magazines, I mean, there is such an extended work, the Photoshop made to every face you see in the magazine. So these faces are not real faces, but they are our idols that we have to, get to, which is totally unreal. And it's just the entire the idea of ever young culture. It doesn't work. It doesn't really work.
But I would like to point out that that's not the cause of it.
No.
It's rather that the media and the businesses and advertising take advantage of it. But the cause lies deeper, and not that I know what it is, but I have a suggestion. It looks from a variety of studies that the preferred body size in terms of BMI, in terms of weight and so on, varies with the availability of food in the time and the place. In cultures and locations and among ethnicities where food is at a premium, where it's rare, attractiveness is attributed to what one would call at least overweight, if not obese, in terms of the...
But just fatness. Fatness is culturally desirable when it's difficult to achieve.
Yeah, right, and it's as obvious as you just said. Now, although it's not extreme fatness, there is a degree of Your word was saftig. That's a good word.
Plumpness.
Plumpness.
Stoutness.
Whereas in cultures where there is a surfeit of food, the opposite is the case, and thinness is. Now, why? There are one or two theories about this. One is that within the setting, it's a sign of health in the other person. Where there's little food around, having a certain amount of body mass is a sign of health. And when there's too much, having not all that much is a sign of health. I think that it's maybe as much or even more status. That somehow, if everybody is of a certain weight, it sets you apart if you had the resources to be different than that. If everybody is thin because they're hungry, and you have more body weight, that's great. You could. It shows you wear it on your sleeve. Now just take a moment to tell you about an experience I had in Taiwan, because it's just so typical of this. I went there, I had a lovely time, my hosts were terrific, and they made a feast for me one evening. And to that feast, they invited the Minister of Health and his wife. Now, everybody in Taiwan has these wonderful bodies that people used to have, at least in East Asia, slim, trim, but not emaciated at all. And comes the Minister of Health, and he's enormous. And his wife is enormous. And the way that differed from our experiences, they were so happy. I still remember, although it was decades ago, how cheerful they were. They were glowing. And they were presenting, not deliberately, but instinctively, a success. Status. Now I see the drive towards ultra-thinness as being the mirror image of that kind of thing. Of course, it then sets very difficult goals to the individual to achieve that, and then, of course, the companies come in and exploit that.
It's a form of conspicuous conspicuous to be thin in this culture.
Exactly.
It's
conspicuous non-consumption.
Conspicuous non-consumption, but consumption of other things that allows for that thinness to be produced, right? And so, of course, everything that is difficult to achieve becomes a symbol of status, and that's why we're
achieved it.
Yeah,
but one also has to be very careful. I will tout my new book, since when Paul was very kind enough to puff it. It came out last week. It's called Fat, A Cultural History of Obesity. And in that there's a chapter on China. It's the first really comparative look at the history of fat in the West and the East. And there's an extraordinary moment at the beginning of the 20th century, right around 1905, right before the imperial China disappears, where there is in urban China an unbelievable anxiety about obesity in a culture which is called the famine culture, right? The sick man of Asia. If you read the newspapers, the magazines, the women's magazines, because there are women magazines at this period, magazines which are written very specifically for middle-class women, there are articles and ads about the dangers of overweight, because it's associated with the dangers of westernization and the dangers of modernization. So again, it's the meaning that, you're right about this, but it's the meaning that is ascribed to body size and body image. Yes, we want to be of our time and place, but we don't want to be too Western and too modern. And what is so fascinating, of course, is that in the last 10 years in communist China, that has reappeared. The major public health anxiety in China, the moral panic in China today, is obesity in the cities, right, in the urban areas. And what is it a sign of? The invasion of McDonald's. It's the West.
Also the consequences.
And the consequences. In cultures, by the way, today and 100 years ago, where rural China is suffering famine and severe underweight. By the way, today also. So this is this fascinating, how do you attribute meaning to body size? How do you attribute meaning to body shape? one has to be very careful, and I'm always careful myself because one has to think historically about taking present cases and making universals about their externals, not about their underpinnings. Marcel, you did this right, but not about the underpinnings, but about the externals, about the symbolic value of bodies. So I asked you about ugly bodies, which is that the people who come into your clinic not only imagine themselves as ugly, but imagine that you, meaning you representing everybody who's looking at them, think of them as ugly. That is, they're putting into the minds of the world, right, that ugliness. What is the meaning then, not only for themselves, but of the world in which they live?
Yeah, that's definitely true. It's often so bad that they actually have frank delusions of reference to the point that they think that others are laughing about them or staring at that defect.
I know the way you really look.
Yeah, exactly. So, which causes a lot of suffering, and they tend to withdraw a lot as a result of that. Absolutely. But I actually did want to pick up on something that you had mentioned a couple of minutes ago, Paul, where you said, where you were hinting a little bit at the media, and because my patients also bring up that a lot, you know, and what we talk about frequently is that when they look at these models, they're basically genetic super freaks. They are so uncommon and rare that, well, that's why they are so highly paid, actually, because they look a certain way, and then before they get on a cover of a magazine, the picture is airbrushed, and these are women who are also men now. It's actually shifting a little bit towards men.
One doesn't want to be here two sexes, even though it starts out around, by the way, 1910 in the West with idealizing women's bodies. Before that, it's men's bodies. The gender question is now shifted back. And men are also represented as ultra thin with the new athletic body.
With the muscles.
It's the lifesome, not the Arnold Schwarzenegger body, right?
But the beauty ideal in general is actually shifting a little bit from being just, it's not so much super thin anymore. It's now shifting more towards a fit ideal.
Yes, the athletic.
It's thin but also firm, and you know. So anyway, so I was glad that you brought that up when you said, well, what are we comparing ourselves to, right? Because these are really unrealistic images that are portrayed by the media and so on. But then somebody raised, I think it was you, who said, but is this really causing body image disturbance, severe body image disturbance? And I don't think it is, because otherwise we would all have eating disorders or body dysmorphic disorder or whatever it might be. So I do think, obviously, the culture and the media play a major role, but there is something else going on beyond that.
I really insist, though, that I think we're in a culture in which having a neurotic attitude towards one's body is totally normal.
Yes,
so
that's true.
What is normal is to have this, you know, is to be in a state of anxiety about one's body, because one is always living in terms of a future fantasy self that you're going to achieve this body through various forms of you know, pharmaceutical or other kinds of intervention, and of course there's very strong economic factors underlying all that. I mean, you're looking at extremes. If you want to look at an extreme, go to Los Angeles and pick up a copy. I did this a few weeks ago. There's a newspaper there called the LA Weekly, which is sort of a Village Voice kind of thing. Actually has some good reporting in it. But literally every single advertisement in it was for body modification, from the front to the end. And now it's just like stuff that I just couldn't have imagined. It's like, you know, breast enhancement is kind of like black and white TV now, right? I mean, it's just sort of like it's like gotten so much more elaborate than that, so that people are now, you know, freaking out about their backs aren't perfect, and there's like all of this fetishism about depilation and everything else.
The hottest procedure in the UK right now is vaginal surgery to create perfect vaginas. And it's quite fascinating to me, where this was a procedure which a few years ago was, if anything, if it were done quietly and unspokenly, and now it's on the front pages of the tabloids, on the evening television at 11 o'clock.
Paul, you've emphasized the social element, but isn't there, I'm not a doctor or anything like that, but isn't there some element of control also, like people with anorexia and bulimia? I mean, there's a whole element there of the control of the body. I mean, the control of the bodily function and being. I mean, you've emphasized totally kind of idealization here. It seems to be the thing.
Yeah, well, the anorexia. I mean, in my experience, looking at this, things, the eating disorders just tend to be extensions of quote-unquote normal behavior. Especially if you look at something that's really fascinating, although horrifying now, is you look at these so-called pro-ana-sites, which are like becoming very, very common. There are hundreds of them on the internet now.
Pro-anorexia.
They're sites where people, and this is one of the sort of dark side of cyberspace, that these people who before would have had difficulty connecting with each other are now creating communities of support, not to like fight against their anorexia, but to valorize
normalize it.
But to normalize it, and it is. I mean, although you're quite right to emphasize that this is becoming affecting men in lots of ways as well. It's still very gendered in the sense that that the vast majority of these people are women and girls, and they. In a way, I mean, I understand perfectly where they're coming from. I mean, they've just internalized the discourse, and they're just saying, okay, well, you want to see a perfect dieter? Okay, I'm going to be the perfect dieter. I'm going to be the hunger artist. I'm going to be the person who can, who can achieve this kind of perfection. And they post these photos of themselves, which they call thinspiration, in which they want people to say to them, yeah, you look okay. You aren't fat, or you're not too thin. And the ideal really is, try to be as thin as you can without killing yourself, and that's just the diet culture. That's just that's just.
But I think there is and you probably can talk about this. There is a point where something becomes a disorder, becomes an illness, becomes a disease. There is a point where the anorexia, the dieter, becomes anorexic, and there's a point when that anorexic gets to a hospital because they're going to die from not eating. So, and the same is true about views of one's body. It's one thing whether you think you're not attractive, you've lost your hair, you've done that, but there are people, and I saw one of them many, many years ago, who thought his ears were too big. A true body dysmorphic. This is a suffering. From morning to night in that person's mind is the idea that his ears are too big and people are laughing about it. So I think one has to make a distinction between some of the social things we talk about and the actual mental conditions. I have in my practice in psychiatry, psychoanalysis for 30 years, 7, if not more, men who come to see me, I know within the first 2 months or 3 months they're going to tell me their penis is too small. The majority of men in my practice have a small penis. And there is a rare person who comes and says something about their penis not being small. And usually the ones who say their penis not being small almost say it with a degree of reticence and shyness. But the men who talk about their penis being too small is very easy, and they always talk about it. But obviously, it's a view that they have, but it's not a disorder. They're not going to have bone put in their penis to make it bigger or have injections on it. They just worry about it. So there is a distinction. There is a.
But is this a spectrum, or is this? I mean, and on that, I mean, this is a great moment. I'm going to open it up for your questions and your observations, ma'am.
Come to the microphone, please, because we're recording you. No, but people are watching this, so we need you to come up.
To the world.
Yes. Yeah.
No pressure.
This is a question for Marina, because I've actually seen a performance in Chelsea a few years ago, and I wanted to know how do you prepare yourself mentally and physically to stand still in the nude, in the cold. It wasn't very heated. for so long, and how do you master that endurance? And have you ever been stalked? Because you're a very striking presence when you offer yourself to the total view, or whatever.
All right.
Or your total body to everybody's view.
I've been always asked this question if I prepare myself, and actually, to tell you the truth, I don't. I start with the concept, and to me, I have lots of different ideas, but the ideas I'm the most afraid of it, that I'm really like completely in panic. This is the ideas I wanted to do. And the ones who they're just okay, I don't even consider them to realize. I'm really interested in difficulties and the ideas where I really think that I almost can't deliver. And then I wanted to actually make them reality. So it's really about the concept, and it's about this idea of that you prepare yourself that in this period of time you will be performing 12 days, 10 days, whatever. Right now I'm preparing the performance, which is going to take 3 months in MoMA Museum, my retrospective, and the title is Artist is Present, and I'm literally going to be 3 months there, 8 hours a day, except Tuesday when the museum is closed. But they really of this pure presence, in the front of audience. So I really think is a willpower, and I don't know how I got it, but I have a very crazy background. My boss, mother and father are kind of old partisan in Tito time, and they both are national heroes. And my whole childhood was the idea of sacrifice, of the believing in legends, believing in the purpose of your life, and put everything to that purpose. So it's just that kind of thing. There was never in my life that I will not do performance if I even want to have temperature. I used to have migraines, not anymore. I would do it in any way. Then I never actually, when I say that I will do it in that time, I will always do it. It's no way. That is like I don't think about. You see, we're talking about ugly bodies and obese bodies and all this. I have lots of problems with my own body, but when I'm performing, I don't think about being ugly, fat, or anything, because the whole thing is about something else. It's about another type of energy you wanted to communicate, and it's not about that kind of ethics, how your body looks like. It's not important anymore. The most fat body, the most ugly the body, the most strange, unusual body, that can be incredibly beautiful if the really spirit come inside, and that's what is the most important. I had one of my students who was extremely fat. She was afraid to lose any gram of her fatness because her whole power is showing that kind of body and performing in this type of the body and not any other. And if you look in the culture, like the Turkish culture, I mean, the expression of Turkish beauty, if you're not like a melon, you're not beautiful at all. Yeah. I mean, at least you have to be like melon. So I think that this culture is especially not healthy. But anyway, about how I'm not preparing. I just put the time, space, and that's it.
The physical strength and endurance.
Yes. No, I do, and I am this year 62, by the way, and I'm still performing. So I don't know. It's just I think you're born with this. I don't have any explanation.
Good.
And I never had any problems.
The next question?
Yes. One topic that wasn't touched on at all, a little bit to my surprise, was the topic of tattooing and piercing and things that people do to their body. And it's one of those things that are so common because all cultures, all times, it's sort of like religion, and I don't understand it at all. It totally confuses me. And I was wondering if anyone had insights to what makes people do these things.
Urban primitives.
Body modification.
I don't know much about tattooing and piercing. I know a lot about plastic surgery, but I actually think that's different. The tattooing and the piercing, I can just give you my sort of common sense approach to it, which is not based on any science. So what I have seen, it's almost like a rite of passage. It's painful to do these things, and you can endure it, and you have the strength to tolerate the pain. That was sort of, with a few patients that I've had who went through this while I was working with them, it was sort of a sense of pride and look, I can do this and I can deal with the pain. But I would love to hear other perspectives.
The line that I use with this is that the young man or woman who has a small butterfly tattooed on their butts today, in 40 years, will have a bat.
No, you're old-fashioned.
One of the things that has happened over the last few years, of course, is an incredible increase in laser surgery for the removal of tattoos. tattooing went from being very much marginal in Western society. It was always associated with the outsider, with the sailor. One of the reasons the Nazis tattooed Jews was, in point of fact, that it was a taboo in terms of the violation of the body. Jews do not, with the exception of circumcision of males, do not alter the body. So that notion of the outsiderdom by the 1960s and 70s in the West, in the United States and in Western Europe, became a sign absolutely of moments of transition, right? Of becoming someone who is both outside of the society, but also now this young minority. And this young minority, as I pointed out, 40 years later is having these things removed. And it makes a whole new industry. It's also a good thing.
No, but we are old-fashioned. I think that there is so much young generation who see this as a beautiful. That's the thing.
Yeah.
And it's like I was reading this book called the Urban Primitives, that actually they really wanted to have something tribal. They wanted to belong to the group.
Absolutely.
They wanted to be different than the rest.
Yeah, but it's the young.
It's young.
I mean, that's what's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There has to be more to this because those kinds of alterations to the body exist through the history and exist in other cultures.
Every single
so it can't just be.
Every single, we're back to meaning attributed. Every single culture that we know of, every single culture has had some type of body modification.
So there must be some other determinant behind this.
Absolutely. But the question is, what is the meaning that is ascribed to the body modification? Right? Again, it's a kind of an uninteresting statement to say that every culture modifies the body. The question is, what does that body modification mean in the body?
Yes, and why is it done?
Yeah.
What determines it?
But I think what is done has to do with then the cultural significance of the body modification. And the ability to modify.
Maybe that's secondary. That's a consequence of what causes that need to do that because it's been done through human existence. It's being done and done and done.
Yeah.
It goes up and down, but it's always done.
Okay.
I like the idea, and it makes a lot of sense, of there's three parts to the body: the physical, the psychic, and the social. And I was wondering what the gentleman here said, because I used to be a baseball player, and I still feel like I'm a baseball player.
Yeah.
I was a baseball player in the 50s, and yet I feel still like my body is that, and it really isn't, in a sense. It's not. I can barely walk sometimes. In terms of balance.
To us, you are a baseball player.
Yeah. Well, and to me. And you also mentioned how people talk to each other. Like say the fans. They talk, and you say they don't even know what they're talking about to each other, but it doesn't matter. To me, sometimes it does matter. I like to talk with somebody who will understand what I'm saying more than, say, somebody that doesn't understand in the same way I do about it. So it's very good for me to hear that I'm still a baseball player. But the other point that you made about when you act, if you've really got the focus right, and the audience has the focus right, well, that's what you're looking for, and that's what sort of they're looking for. Well, it could be the same thing on a ball field. If they're focusing correctly, the ball players, and they're doing what they're supposed to do, the fans, whether they know they're doing it the right way or not, will be identifying with it so closely, and the excitement gets so big, especially when the whole game is very tense. Who's going to win, who's not going to win? It's actually can be an amazing thing. And I sort of connect the two.
The energy helps you, that energy.
That's right. Also, I can notice, or I think you said it, the mind of the player. Mm-hmm. If he's doing it right, or I think I do,
yeah.
And sometimes I know I'm right, because sometimes I'll see a change, say a week later, that they've worked out about how it's going, that we can actually know what's on somebody's mind.
Outside of his mind, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, we can
So this has been wonderful for me. Thank
Paul?
you.
Yeah, there's a wonderful passage in a Portnoy's complaint where where Alexander Portnoy, the narrator, is like just this tormented figure, but there's one place where he feels okay, And that's when he's playing center field.
Yeah.
And it's not because he's a great center fielder, it's because he knows how to conduct his body in that context.
Yeah.
All the gestures that are the appropriate gestures to have,
Yeah.
to move like a baseball player. He says, is it true that there are people in life who go around feeling the way I do when I'm in center field?
Yeah.
Right, and it's a wonderful, it really captures that, I think.
Marcel.
Marcel, I think you would have something to say about this issue of the maintenance.
Well, let's see if I say the right thing. The gentleman, one of the points the gentleman was making was the audio being in sync between the observer and the active person. And this is the entrainment that I was talking about early, and it's embodied because you can actually see the audience leaning or otherwise making movements which are the beginnings of what they either see the focus of their attention doing or hope he will do. And there's one lovely picture I saw from Ireland of a person bowling, and all the observers, people watching, all with their bodies bent forward in the direction where the ball was going to go. I wanted to just add that.
My name is Ken. I'm an artist, and I'm directing this comment to Professor Campos. I look around this room, everybody looks fantastic. This is New York City, and I take note, you're from Colorado, where I think everybody's busy climbing mountains. But when I go up to my place in Pennsylvania, rural areas, or upstate New York, I see a lot of people that are huge. You see them in the supermarkets pushing around fast food and Fritos and stuff. So there is really, and I saw it in West Virginia, in these areas, there is an obesity problem. It's not, it exists, and I take note that when I've traveled in South America and Central America, I don't see that kind of problem. I see, lean people for the reasons that were discussed, that they don't have access to that kind of stuff. So I was just like to hear what you had to say about that.
Well, it's quite true that there has been a significant increase in the number of people who are quite fat in the developed world. That's very true. One of the things that gets misunderstood is that the weight gain is not, when you hear that, the things that there's this much of an increase in obesity or this much of an increase in overweight, so-called, this is not evenly distributed across the population. The people who are at the far right end of the tail are far, far more likely to gain a lot of weight in conditions which lead themselves to weight gain, as you would expect. Meanwhile, the thinnest quartile of the American population doesn't weigh any more than it did 40 years ago. There hasn't been any weight gain on average in the thinnest 25%. So the determinants of, these determinants are not evenly distributed across the population. Now, I'm not saying that's not any problem whatsoever, that there should be people who are getting very fat in developed countries. I wouldn't claim that. But I would say is, keep in mind that those thin people in South America have significantly lower life expectancies than the really fat people in America.
Thank you.
Because it's much better to be a fat person in a rich country than a thin person in a poor one. And you can, in fact, you can compare this quite directly with like the Pima in the Southwest United States, and then their genetic cousins in northern Mexico who are very similar genetically, who are much thinner. The Pima are very fat in America because they have the thrifty gene. They lived in these ecological niches where people who did not store energy really efficiently just wouldn't reproduce, and so they've gotten very fat in this culture, and they have high rates of diabetes. That's quite true, but they still have significantly longer life expectancy than their cousins in northern Mexico, because affluence causes two things. Well, it causes lots of things, but two things that it causes are obesity and better overall public health. And not that the obesity is causing better overall public health, of course, but that there's that factor. And the other thing I would ask people to remember, too, and when you see fat people, remember you are in a culture which has made you hypersensitive to fatness. And I call this the blue minivan phenomenon. Imagine if, like, you were obsessed with blue minivans for some reason. Suppose, like, your lover had betrayed you in a blue minivan or something, right? And you would probably go around saying, there's nothing but blue minivans in this city. There's like, I saw 74 blue minivans today, and somebody who had exactly the same optical experiences would not be able to tell you whether they had seen any blue minivans. We have been so sensitized to seeing a fat body as like a problem and a source of panic that, you know, I've heard I think we should take a critical attitude towards, you know, the fact that we see this fatness. And also, by the way, it's very unclear the extent to which people's dietary habits are correlated with their fatness. You know, this assumption that the reason these people are fat is because they're eating all this bad food for them is really not well documented at all. It's this kind of folk psychology that we've dropped onto the situation in the process of moralizing it. Mm-hmm. So, you know, but again, I wouldn't claim that it's not a problem at all. Just I wouldn't say that. Well, anyways, I'll stop there.
No.
There's one more question.
No, we have time.
Is there another question?
We have time.
We have time. I just wanted to make sure because
No, we have time.
I don't want somebody hitting me with a large brick bat. Sir.
This is a short question. It actually has to do with your blue minivan, but it's for Sabine. It's for Sabine.
Okay.
It's body dysmorphic disorder.
Yeah.
Basically, these people think they have a blue minivan on their face,
In essence, yes.
but they don't.
But yeah.
And I was just wondering, like, about particular cases. Have you ever seen like a particular success case?
Oh yeah.
And how do you convince people that they don't have this blue minivan on their face? Like, do you do an intervention where their friends say, "Hey, you don't have a blue minivan on your face," and then they say, "My friends are lying to me"? I mean, that sense of personal disillusionment or delusionment. Like, how do you get over that? How do you attack that?
That's a great question, actually. Unfortunately, just their friends saying, "No, you look fine," doesn't work, because usually by the time they come to see me, they have heard that hundreds of times, and it still didn't promote the kind of change that they were hoping for. So, I mean, there are basically two empirically proven treatments for body dysmorphic disorder right now, and still, I mean, the research on this disorder is still so much in its infancy, so I wish there would be more people getting involved with this. One is pharmacotherapy. They usually respond very well to high doses of SSRIs, very high doses, just like you know, it's an antidepressant. It's an antidepressant medication. So that's a one way. And of course, my background is mostly in cognitive behavior therapy. That's a short-term treatment for body dysmorphic disorder, and I've spent actually years developing one that can be done in about 22 sessions. So, and basically, what we do, we start out with psychoeducation. We talk a lot about those things that we actually just discussed here early on. You know, different theories why they might have developed that disturbed body image, also to get that idea across that what you think you look like, you know, and how you interpret your own appearance might actually be quite different from what other people see when they look at you. The worst thing you can do for your patients is to just get in some kind of power struggle about what they really look like. Oh, no, your ears are fine. No, they are not. Because then you lose them. I mean, they have been through that. So what you agree on right from the start is that the person is suffering. That's why they came to you in the first place. And that's where, you know, your opinion sort of merges with there, and then you go from there. So you talk a little bit about different theories of body image development, how body image is different from appearance. And then we usually move on from there into what I call a conceptualization of themselves. So we try to come up with we try to draw a diagram basically for them. And I usually give them some examples about myself. I might say, look, you know, I have this red spot right here on my forehead, and I don't know if you can see it right now. So okay. Okay.
It's very obvious.
All right. Oh no. So you know, and one way for me to deal with that would be to look at the mirror and to think, oh no, there's this red spot and it's extremely ugly, and maybe because of this red spot, everybody will be staring at this spot today, and maybe I shouldn't even come because it will be so embarrassing if everybody would notice it, and maybe I better stay at home, or if I do go, I better spend like a lot of time putting on multiple concealers and makeup and so on so that I can hide it from others. So that would be one way. The other way would be to say, it's a red spot, well, big deal, I don't particularly like it, and kind of forget about it and move on with my day. And the starting point is always the same, but depending on how I interpret my red spot, right, determines how I feel. In one case, obviously pretty miserable, perhaps ashamed, and what I do in one case, excessive camouflaging behavior and perhaps avoidance behavior. And usually we can draw out something like that very easily for every patient. And then we sort of write on the side what the different psychological factors might have been that might have contributed to their poor body image. We discussed a lot of those today. If there are any actual body image, body problems that they have had in the past, like severe acne or some kind of disfigurement or teasing experience, whatever it might be. And we kind of write there in a very simple diagram, we sort of draw that for them. And then we use this as a basis for our intervention. So we track whatever it is that they're thinking at any given moment, and we begin to evaluate their thoughts and sort of look at them in terms of how helpful the thoughts are for them, how valid the thoughts are. We often find certain cognitive errors. Many of them were mentioned today, like magnification, you said, right? They sort of selectively attend to their flaws, and in their mind they kind of blow them out of proportion, right? Or perfectionism has been mentioned today. It's like, oh, either I'm absolutely beautiful, and if I'm not absolutely beautiful, that means if I have one flaw, I already fall into the ugly category. So often we find cognitive distortions like that.
But when they've succeeded, like, what is that click in their mind where they all of a sudden...
It's not one click. It's not one, oh, I got it, and now I understand it's all different. You really start with those cognitive interventions that I just briefly described. Then you help them cut down those ritualistic behaviors. You know, you cut down the excessive makeup or the excessive exercise or the excessive mirror checking or whatever it might be. You slowly but surely engage them in social situations again. You work with mirrors a lot, like you do a lot with eating disordered patient. You know, usually when they stand in front of the mirror, most of these people with body image concerns actually, when they stand in front of a mirror, they sort of zoom right into that hot spot. Like, it would be like me if I just look in the mirror and just look at my red spot, for example, right? And I could do that if I had BDD. I would probably do that for 2 hours a day. And then you can imagine if I do that for 2 hours a day, after a while that red spot would look pretty huge and ugly to me.
Like a blue minivan.
Yeah, it would look like a blue minivan. And over the course of the therapy, you kind of teach them all of these different strategies, which is pretty powerful.
Plenty of them.
Yeah. We have another question now.
Just one very simple question. So for a person with body dysmorphic disorder, if you have to make a self-portrait, do they depict themselves accurately, or do they show distortion?
No, that's a great question. We have done it a lot in group therapy. We had them draw what they think they look like. And for example, if they have a nose concern, they draw a huge and obvious nose, whereas in reality they have a normal sized nose.
Story now,
yeah, it's a real distortion.
This is a personal story. I'm 12 years old. This is former Yugoslavia. I have orthopedic shoes because and really ugly one. I have the how you call short hair with the 2 pins and child face and extremely big nose. I feel terrible, ugly, really ugly. So I was obsessed by Brigitte Bardot, and she was like perfect nose. So I have all the photographs of Brigitte Bardot, and I wanted my mother, bring me to the plastic surgery to have the Brigitte Bardot nose. And every time I would suggest this, she would just slap my face. It was end of the story. So I make the perfect. So I made the perfect plan. I had all kinds of photographs, profile, unfast, all different, all showed up from the newspaper, cut in my pocket. It's a Sunday afternoon. My parents was not home, and I am, I would go to that was my plan. I go to the big, the bedroom, and this matrimonial bed with the sharp edges. So the plan was like this: I would spin around as fast as possible to fall on the edge of the bed, really break my nose, and then, of course, I'm going to hospital. Of course, I have the Brigitte Bardot photographs already in the pocket. It's just the question of, of organizing, and everything is done, So I really do this. I spin very fast, and I just fall on the edge, but I miss it, and I really cut myself badly on the side. So I'm lying down, really in pain. All the photographs of Brigitte Bardot images on the floor. My mother entered the space, slapped my face, and this is the end of the story. I never did it. But I got cured of it.
This has happened to me many times where my patients broke their nose on purpose because they couldn't afford to pay for the surgery. So they just broke the nose so that they would get the surgery.
The most fascinating historical moment is in the 1920s at the point where nose reductions become commonplace in the United States, and we notice an extraordinary division. Most of the patients in the 1920s in the United States who are having nose jobs are women, while all of the originary patients in the 1890s were all men. And I said to myself, what happened to the men? The men developed deviated septa.
Yeah, right.
Right? In other words, by the 1920s, plastic surgery, aesthetic surgery was seen as vanity surgery. But if you had a deviated septum for which the exact same surgical procedure is undertaken, right, you could go to the physician and say, I'm not breathing well, I need to have my nose reshaped. And if you then correct for the number of men having deviated septa, there are more men having nose jobs in the 1920s than women. So it's exactly this wonderful question about what meaning do we ascribe to what body part?
Right.
Before there's a question, I just wanted to make a quick comment because my psychoanalyst colleagues would be upset if I don't say anything about how psychoanalysis sees these things.
Absolutely.
There is a phenomenon in psychoanalysis called displacement.
Sure.
That is, you are really worried about A, but you focus only on B. So that for some of these patients, it is felt that the problem is really a displacement from something else. And the cure would be to understand what it is that is being avoided by this difference.
I actually have two questions, and so I'll ask them both. And the first one, because the first one is on this plastic surgery track. And one thing about features, I mean, most of us, not most of us, all of us, our features have a history. They've, you know, the various ancestors have contributed to some kind of polyglot set of features, and in holding a feature in contempt, or admiring a feature that we have, what is the role of secret ancestry or one's parents who one has lived with in one's feelings about plastic surgery, and actually changing the family history by undergoing it. So that's the other question is about the audience, and I think you could say a lot about it. I was very struck when you introduced the history. I admire your work, by the way. And I was struck when you introduced yourself that the history of performance art, you spoke of Vito Acconci as an originator. And of course, you know, there's a history before that, but it's an originator of a particular art.
This is also happening, but not performance as a performance. What's happening is different, sorry. Anyway.
And, but something about Acconci's work, my question is about the audience itself and its existence or the degree to which it's really there or maybe not. I mean, some of Acconci's pieces, he did the performance, and what the audience saw was the photograph later, or performances, you know, which went on before Acconci's
there was
time.
a famous one where he was masturbating in the gallery.
Right. Well, the audience was there, but they didn't see it.
He was downstairs.
Right. But so they were there, but didn't see. So there's the visual sense. But then there were performances that he did in his studio and photographed. So the audience came later, or the audience could be, you know, way later after you're deceased. There are performances like that, and so it's the actual audience, the imagined audience, and all that has a history that, oddly enough, I guess I won't go into it. I want to hear what all of you have to say.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the performance?
No, let's start first with the...
Okay, I can answer that first question pretty quick. So you had asked about, you know, if a person wants to modify a particular body part, what does that mean for their ancestors, perhaps even the race that they belong to, all of that. And that does come up quite a bit, you know. So we have people who come in from minority groups and who want to modify a feature so that they look more like they are part of the majority group. Or we have people who come in who say, you know, my father was sexually abusive and now I have his nose and I don't want this nose anymore. And obviously if these things occur, you have to dig a little deeper. You can't just do your little, you know, treatment in the way that I just outlined it, but you have to be very aware of you know, culture and other trauma treatments, perhaps. So in those cases, I would go a little bit beyond of what I was just describing. It's not always like that, though, but it does come up for sure.
Yeah.
So, and then you incorporate those pieces into the treatment.
Yeah. The nose job, the first modern nose job, is developed by a surgeon in Berlin by the name of Jacques Joseph in 1895. And not only was he a Jewish surgeon, but in point of fact, his patients were Berlin Jews whose desire was to, quote unquote, pass as German. The noses, and that's why this is fascinating, the noses that he crafted, right? Where do you get the shape of the nose? He got from art history books representing Greek sculpture, right? By, 1960, young Jewish women in Long Island who got nose jobs wanted to look, of course, not at all like a piece of Greek sculpture, but they wanted to look an awful lot like the idealized British actresses of the 1950s with their tiny upturned nose. Or the British Brigitte Bardot. I mean, what fascinates me, of course, again, is the meanings attributed to these noses. And so one wants to be very careful. And by the way, this is not just the case of Jews in Berlin. The other nose job that was developed more or less at the same time was dealing with Irish noses in New York. The Irish noses in New York were precisely the noses that the Jewish girls in Long Island got in the 1960s. And the noses that they became were, surprise, surprise, Roman noses that looked an awful lot like the Jewish noses that were becoming Greek noses in Berlin at exactly the same time.
Oh, that's okay. Another story about nose. There's an artist, French artist called Orlan, who had the idea to have on her face the biggest nose that a human being can carry. So she asked even me if I can get a piece of for her nose. She found a Japanese surgeon who was going to do that operation. So that should be a really big nose. But on the end, it was no permission done because there was some problem with the health, breathing and so on. So they didn't really permit it. But that was like her biggest wish was to have Pinocchio nose.
She wanted to be like Cyrano de Bergerac.
And this was quite incredible, just like going to other opposite direction of what we think is beauty into some other thing, which I think is interesting.
I also wanted to mention the sociologist at UCLA, Abigail Seguí, is doing some really interesting work right now, extending the work of Irving Goffman in regard to stigma and covering. And that's something to think about here, that plastic surgery and other forms of body modification and even dieting can be thought of as a form of covering, as a way of like trying to hide the stigmatized characteristic, as a way of dealing with this sense of marginalization that's produced by a sense of body dysmorphism or what have you. And so I mean, following up also on what you were saying, Sandra, I think it's interesting to think about how the blonde bombshell got to be like the model of the supposedly ideal American woman. I mean, I'm speculating here, but I think it might have something to do with the fact that all of these Jewish owners of the big studios were so fanatical about not representing anything that looked Jewish at all on the screen, and so they ended up like producing this like weird idealized vision of like this certain kind of Nordic woman as being like the ideal.
Absolutely.
I just have to answer the performance, just audience very shortly. You see, the Marcel Duchamp said that one thing was really important, that the audience complete the work of the artwork, and the role of audience is very important. Without audience, there is no artwork, because that have to communicate. And but there are different ways of looking into the audience. Like Conchit is really true. He made lots of the homemade movies, performances. Then through the video, he communicate the message, and then what you see is not real performance, but is seeing the video. But what I think, in my preference, is really direct performance, to the audience, and direct dialogue, energy dialogue with the audience, which actually the audience and the performer complete the work itself. They help each other in many ways. Okay.
Sure.
In the discussion of body dysmorphism, I was reminded of a discussion I had when I was about 16 with a friend of mine who observed that whenever he looked in the mirror, he tended to hold his breath and puff up his chest. Mm-hmm. Later, in the wake of that conversation, acknowledged that I would hold my eyebrows up in my face whenever I looked in the mirror, which was not a way in which I would want to appear, and yet it was a way that felt satisfying, which in a way seems like the opposite of body dysmorphism, where you have patients who are deriving dissatisfaction from a feature of their body that is not accurate. Whereas my friend and I hope it's somewhat common. We're driving satisfaction with our appearance from something which is actually inaccurate, and deliberately so.
That's interesting.
And it really makes me wonder, speaking therapeutically, do you, not for me, for your patients, whether you would encourage your patients to see themselves, look in the mirror accurately and honestly and become comfortable with that accurate and honest picture of themselves, or with whatever version or whatever rendition of themselves that they are satisfied and comfortable with.
What we currently tend to do with them is to look in the mirror in a kind of holistic way. I described earlier, just briefly, that they just zoom into those body parts that they don't like and look at them for a long period of time. They're terrified while they do that and very ashamed and anxious. It's probably very different from how we look in the mirror, where we also might fix things, but it's just this staring at this one body part. So we try to, often we start by just teaching them to look from top to bottom. We put them in front of a whole-length mirror. They start by describing their hair, and then they, if I were to do it myself, I would say my hair is brown, it's shoulder length, my face is oval, a couple of lines on my forehead, my nose is 1.5 inches long, I have a little red spot on my forehead, but this kind of stuff. But I don't get sort of hung up on one body part. So I describe it holistically, objectively, without beating myself up, sort of non-judgmentally, and that's a really very difficult new skill for them. Over time, they get more playful. Over time, they also notice things that they have never noticed before. They might even, I always tell them at first, be objective when you describe your body. But over time, you will notice that they slip in little positive things. And they might say, oh, I like my beautiful eyes or something like that. And I don't correct them then, because it seems so great that they can suddenly see that. But it's very different from how you are describing that you are looking in the mirror, where you can actually almost play a little bit and posture a little bit. It's not like that at all. It's a very anxiety-driven staring that they often do.
And most people, and there's lovely studies with undergraduates who are, of course, the psychologists' white rats, right? Undergraduates, if you ask undergraduate males to estimate their weight, they always estimate their weight 5 pounds too light.
Yes.
And if you ask undergraduate females to estimate their weight, they always estimate their weight 5 pounds too heavy. And this is the objective subjective, right?
Yes.
That is, this has to do with sort of gender bias and the way we imagine our bodies to be. But that's not pathological, I would say. That's not the anorexic looking in the mirror and looking at their 90-pound body and seeing a person weighing 500 pounds.
Yeah,
right?
no, I just want to add to that.
Okay.
That's actually true, that healthy people tend to overestimate their attractiveness a little bit. I mean, this has...
I don't. I'm really attractive.
Whereas, obviously people who have major body image disorders don't.
But again, the real question that one wants to address to this is this a spectrum? Right? And this is, by the way, not resolvable. In other words, do we go from quote-unquote normal subjective ways of imagining the body through to pathological ways, or the pathological ways, in point of fact, in the sense a radical subset? And by the way, there ain't no answer to that, right? Sadly, there ain't no answer to that. Yeah.
And I would say also that if we broke all the mirrors in the world, we would still have problems.
Absolutely.
Because it's how we perceive each other and how we behave with each other.
Yeah.
I will reveal a story, which I didn't think I was going to do today, but since this all came up, I think it's pertinent. For years, I was an OR nurse with a rather well-known oral maxillofacial surgeon. And one day, a patient said to me casually, as I was moving from one space to another, not in the operating room, the office, "Oh, I see olive oil was here. I said, what? He said, oh, yeah, she was in the waiting room. I said, I don't know who you're talking about. He said, I know her. I work on Wall Street, and she's down there, olive oil. Now, I knew who he was talking about, but I did not pick up on it. This woman had a beautiful face to me. Wonderful eyebrows, deep-set eyes, a mellifluous voice, very intelligent. However, she had a major functional problem in the fact that her upper bone here could not be fixed with orthodontia because it went this way, so that her teeth were this way. And her bottom jaw was very small, it was not developed. It was, I don't want to say class 5, whatever it is. It's a very underdeveloped jaw, very overdeveloped portion over here. She was successful in her job, and she came to the office as a referral because she was getting divorced, and she wanted to have some work done. When you're looking at bodies, it's a body and a mind and a culture. Form and function are involved. You do a lot of things with your mouth. You eat, you kiss, you curse, you love, whatever. There's a lot going on with the mouth and the face. This woman was married, and her husband introduced her as his sister because he didn't want anyone to think he was married to this woman, whom he obviously must have had affection for and loved, otherwise he wouldn't have married her. I don't know if she ever had any psychological help, but she got to a point where she could not deal with it and felt that the surgery would alleviate part of it. The surgeon planned with a psychiatrist, or with a head and neck person. There was a big team of people who interviewed this person because it is the soul, it is the mind, it is the heart. It's not just the body. And a lot of planning went into this because you have to actually open the side of the face and separate those jaws and figure out what to put in and take out, and then get that person prepared after all the surgery is done, hopefully successfully, wire that person up, cannot eat, do anything but a straw for 6 months, then prepare that person possibly for orthodontia. Well, I will tell you that this was an extraordinary case, this written up, because she ends up from being totally underdeveloped, overdeveloped, to somebody who is now on the scale, as you say, 135 is a whatever, 5'6". Okay, what do we have? We have Caucasian faces, we have faces from Tibet, we have all kinds of faces that we have decided that the Caucasian face is the beautiful face or whatever. This person was from the Caribbean, and she was very beautiful. When the treatment was completely determined, and it was done in phases, the husband found out about this and came to the hospital in the third phase when she was basically in very good shape, and was crying. He was on his knees, he was crying. Horrible, that he loved her, he didn't want a divorce. And she said, it's too late. There's too much pain. I'm the same person I was before. I just got fixed. Other people will respond to me differently, but I am still the same person. You will now see me as someone beautiful because other people see me as beautiful. And she had the strength, the conviction, and the ability to move forward with her life in a very positive way. So I would like you to know that how we look at people when we think they're dumb because they're malformed is very painful, extraordinarily painful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I thank you all very much.
programs and a complete archive of past Philoctates events is available at philoctates.org.